Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this second conversation in our Protect Democracy series. I am incredibly excited to be joined by this group of panelists who I'm going to introduce to you in full. But first, I just want you to understand how many countries and places we've coordinated for this one. We have Van Jackson.
Hi, I'm from New Zealand, or I'm in New Zealand.
In New Zealand. We have Catherine Leela Cho.
Hi, I'm calling in from Taipei this morning.
And we have Scott Nakagawa.
Hi, I'm calling in from Berkeley, California.
We're sharing this discussion with you and everyone tuning in from Germany this time during the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is being commemorated by Berlin Freedom Week. It's a citywide festival and initiative in Berlin to promote the values of freedom, democracy, and human rights. And we are honored that our film in this panel will be part of it, especially as former President Tsai Ing-wen will be there in person and on the heels of an historic speech by current Vice President Bi Khim-hsiao at the European Parliament in Brussels. Tonight, we turn to one of the most pressing global challenges of our time, the question of how to fight authoritarianism. Authoritarian powers exploit democratic openness, our financial systems, our information networks, and our social divisions to push narratives and policies that serve their interests only. And too often, democracies respond in isolation, treating these issues as regional rather than systemic. Invisible Nation shows how Taiwan has become both a target and a model, a country on the front lines of authoritarian pressure that has developed creative democratic responses we can all learn from. We're joined by these three brilliant thinkers and advocates I am so excited to introduce to help us connect Taiwan's experience to the global struggle for democracy. Really, truly honored to have Scott Nakagawa, the co-founder and executive director of 22nd Century Initiative, who has served as an organizer, political strategist, and social movement analyst in the struggle against authoritarianism and for equitable and inclusive democracy since 1988. We have Dr. Van Jackson, who's just been promoted to Department Chair of International Relations at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. He's a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C., and a senior research advisor at the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. Van hosts the Undiplomatic podcast. You can see he's got a good podcast setup, and co-hosts the Bang Bang podcast, an anti-imperialist show about war movies and political thrillers. Catherine Cho has written the most brilliant book, Revolutionary Taiwan, Making Nationhood in a Changing World, with co-author Mark Harrison. You can listen to this book as I just did, by the way. If you like audiobooks and you like walking at the same time, there's a function on the Kindle app that allows you to, it's a robot voice that reads it, but it's still really awesome to listen to the book and or read the book. It's a must read. And Catherine is also teaching assistant professor of world history at National Chengchi University in Taipei, Taiwan. So let's begin by grounding ourselves in the big picture, how the authoritarian forces of corruption, repression, and disinformation are reshaping global politics and what that means for democratic societies everywhere. I think we'll start with you, Van. From your perspective as a strategist, how do authoritarian regimes coordinate across regions, and why do democracies struggle to respond with the same level of cohesion?
Yeah, I mean, there is a short answer to that, and then there's like a more profound answer possibly. So the short answer is that there really is a kind of playbook with common narratives, common practices of censoring free speech, red tagging, weakening labor unions, right? Scapegoating marginalized groups. In your last panel, you had Stacey Abrams talking about the 10 steps to authoritarianism. I think knowing all that stuff is kind of, necessary but insufficient. And so there's this more foundational question underneath that, which is something like, what makes a society more vulnerable to authoritarian practices? And I take that as a kind of root cause type question. And the one answer to that, or the answer that I would be like most inclined to offer off the cuff, is like the source of vulnerability to authoritarianism is the key sources like domestic inequality and a precarious working class majority, right? So there's a ton of research about this, but there was one particular study in 20 where they showed the far right rise in France in the 20 teens, like it was a direct consequence of the atomization and alienation of the French working class under neoliberalism. That financialization of the economy and everything that came with it led workers in France to no longer identify with their economic class. So neoliberalism killed class solidarity. And in that identity vacuum, what filled it was ethno-nationalist tropes, anti-immigration, like all the bullshit, right? And so there's a problem there, right? There was another study in, I think, 2023 that showed, again, like smoking gun proof that participation in the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 directly caused an increase in labor militancy in the US, which is in my lifetime, very rare, right? But like a greater willingness to go on strike, and then New Start labor organizing efforts too. And that is a threat to the power of oligarchs, to the capitalist class. Like that is an answer to why corporations went, quote unquote, anti-woke after being superficially supportive of like BLM and equality in the workplace and all of that, right? The corporations can be strategic allies, but they are not our friends, So in a representational sense and in a material sense, the fight against inequality is like the most potent way to fight against authoritarianism. And if we think about like why democracies struggle to kind of keep up with what you might call like far right transnationalism or something like that. I think the common answer is that like democracy is messy, it's hard to coordinate. But the deeper answer is that democracies as we know them are just way less democratic than we would like to think. And like representational equality should be a promissory note for material equality. But if we practice a politics that separates these two things as if they have nothing to do with each other, we're making ourselves vulnerable to authoritarian appeals and authoritarian practices, right? So like we're authoring a kind of fascist future in refusing economic democracy, in essence. And so, Vanessa, your introduction kind of gestured at this, but I would double down on it, which is just authoritarian messages and tactics. They don't work in a vacuum. They work by exploiting existing cleavages in society. There's no cleavage greater than between those who have and those who ain't got. And so an equal society is a solidaristic society, is a durable multiracial democracy with class consciousness.
Brilliant. Catherine, can you tell us something about the threats that Taiwan is facing in this moment of authoritarian push and democratic backsliding?
Yeah, so my own background is as a Taiwanese American. I was born and raised in the States, and my father had actually left Taiwan in the 80s because he had spoken out against the one-party Kuomintang regime that was in power at the time. And his livelihood was threatened, and he was harassed and surveilled when he served in the army. And so for him, going to the US was a way to escape that. And while he was in the US, he was able to speak out against the repressive regime that he had left behind in Taiwan, and also to speak out against the United States support of the KMT regime. So I have been reflecting a lot on the strangeness of moving to Taiwan at this time when the second Trump administration has really been sort of speed running a Project 2025 playbook. And so what we're seeing in the US is the suppression of certain kinds of speech in it targeted towards kind of domestic audiences. What we're seeing also is the U.S. signaling through raising tariffs or trying to back out of multilateral agreements that it may not necessarily be a reliable partner for democratic allies around the world. And so I think that is something that leaves Taiwan in a particularly vulnerable position. Taiwan in particular, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is that the US really has been its strongest unofficial ally. And so the credibility of the US as a democracy, when it presents itself as a democracy and when it condemns other regimes for being authoritarian and non-democratic, I think we're in a moment in which that credibility is really being shredded. And so I think that leaves Taiwan quite exposed. And it also, I think, it really exposes this kind of double standard, can the US credibly, right, call out Chinese threats against Taiwan, Chinese repression of Taiwan's ability to kind of function and maneuver in the international system if the US itself, right, is sort of engaging in a lot of these same tactics at home. And I think we can, of course, argue about the scale of the implementation and also, whether or how long lasting some of these new policies will be. But for now, I think in this moment, it really leaves Taiwan quite vulnerable. And then, of course, on the other side, I think, the reality, I think, is that if the decline of kind of American power, the decline of American empire leaves an opening for a Chinese rise. And I think, again, Taiwan is quite unique in this case because for Taiwan, the rise of a Chinese standing kind of in the world means that more countries, even democratic countries, have less incentive to speak out for Taiwan, to speak out in defense of its democracy. And one thing Mark and I talk a lot about in our book is what we call the sort of asymptotic limits of democracy. Taiwan has achieved a lot through its democratization. I think it's won a lot of international at least sympathy, if not outright support, because it is a democratic society now, post kind of 1980s and 1990s. And as you detail like so compellingly in Invisible Nation, it is a story that I think seizes people's attention and tugs at their heartstrings kind of once they're able to learn about it, once they're kind of shown the struggle that Taiwan engaged in to achieve that democracy. But really, like, what's needed, I think, is for other countries around the world, other regimes, other polities to be willing to speak out in defense of Taiwan's international space, of Taiwan's right to participation in key international organizations. The fact that Taiwan is a democracy in and of itself cannot help it achieve that kind of mutual international recognition that I think is the key to sort of preserving that democracy. And so I would say those are the types of threats that Taiwan is really facing in this moment. It can't, no matter how well run and how transparent the elections are in Taiwan, no matter how much energy there is on the ground for civic participation, Taiwan cannot in itself elect its way, participate its way into visibility and a kind of place within the international order.
So well said. And thank you also for sharing your personal story in addition to understanding Taiwan through that lens is extremely helpful. And it's a good way to transition to Scott, who I check in on his Substack regularly to understand what we here in the United States can do about our democracy, because you're absolutely right, Catherine, that we need to be embracing it and pushing it forward if we're going to be supporting democracies like Taiwan's internationally. But Scott, help us understand where we are as a democracy here in the US right now with an authoritarian leaning government and increasing racism and right wing white Christian nationalism. All of it is putting us people, we the people, in a very precarious position.
Yeah, well, I'll begin by saying that authoritarian movements always go down avenues of race and gender. And what we've been witnessing in the United States over the last several decades has been an all-out assault from the far right on the idea of the possibility of a multiracial and gender equal United States of America, right? They went after immigrants and vilified them. They took us from immigration limitation debates in the 80s to total bans and now mass deportation, simply by racializing immigrants and presenting them to us as demonic others, right? They've done the same thing on abortion. They've done the same thing on many different kinds of issues. So, at this point, we're a very divided people, deeply atomized, and in fact, segregated, physically segregated from one another according to our ideological commitments, right, for the most part. So people actually eat differently, talk differently, dress differently, and live in different zip codes according to their belief systems, which makes other groups far more remote to us, right? Those that we see ourselves as disagreeing from. Here in the United States, on the other hand, we're not as polarized as people think we are on the major issues. Those issues like healthcare and schooling and housing, et cetera, the bread and butter issues, we're not that far apart. Of course, now polls here in the United States, when they ask people those questions, basically focus on issues, right? They don't just let people say what's really bothering you. When you do that, other things do come up. But on those key issues that really are the foundation of our ability to have stable families and stable communities, people largely agree. Where the polarization exists is at the level of the political parties, or has been at the level of the political parties. The political parties have become extremely polarized. And as a result, those who are the most politically engaged on the right and the left, who track politics at that level and pay attention to the parties, have themselves become extremely polarized. And then in the social media environment we're in, have basically promulgated more and more of what we call toxic polarization, polarization based on demonization and othering. And so that's the mix that we're in. At present, Donald Trump basically, had this sort of accidental success in 2016 that put the Republican Party in a position to be able to prepare for an authoritarian takeover from the inside out. When he finally broke through and won the presidency in 2024, that then brings us to the point of consolidation, right? That's the typical pattern. It's preparation, breakthrough, and consolidation. So we're in the consolidation phase now. I don't think at this point you could call the United States a liberal democracy. I think that we're more of a competitive or authoritarian state. This is a pattern we see all over the world. Catherine talked about how isolated Taiwan is and how difficult it would be for them from the inside out to be able to preserve their democracy. That's because 72% of the people in the world, by some estimates, now live under autocratic governments. And when autocrats take over in those places, they tend to start out as with competitive authoritarianism, where elections are allowed, but tampered with in a way that makes it very unlikely that the authoritarians will lose. We're kind of at that phase now, and we hear threats from the Trump administration all the time about voting machines and voting processes, changing rules, et cetera, that lead us to believe that there might be an attempt at a steal in the coming midterm elections next year. And so, we're in a kind of a difficult situation. Typically, when authoritarians break through, you have about 12 to 18 months to turn things around. We are deep in that period of time now, but that is a historical pattern, not a rule, right? Some say that we'll get there even faster because Trump has been moving very, very quickly, unusually quickly compared to other authoritarians around the world that are his, his cronies. He's, according to Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who's an expert on these issues, really like accelerating at the speed of one who has actually launched a successful coup. And so we could have very much less time. The United States, though, does have some key assets on our side, some key advantages. One of which is that we have really robust civil society. We have many, many organizations, many of them network together. We have, entire philanthropic sector, et cetera. Those things make a really big difference because civil society is the key when these things happen. The other thing is that we still have independent media. It's that space is being taken over, but we still do have independent voices in the media, and we have an independent judiciary to some extent, right? And then finally, what we have are resistant states that within our federal system, which is unusual around the world, have a lot of room to try to maneuver, to resist, and to try to hold out. States like Oregon, where I usually live, I'm here in Berkeley because I'm here to lecture to a group of students at the college campus here. But that is sort of where we're at. It's a really terrifying time. People often say, but we've been here before. I would argue we haven't, that this is something entirely new to us. It doesn't necessarily make it worse, but it makes it far more dangerous. And we should be thinking about that as we move forward. I want to say these couple of different things. I think they're important to people, right? You've heard that term, that number 3.5%. Erica Chenoweth's magic number, 3.5% of people in mass resistance movements in order to be able to topple a dictator. That's a historical thing again. It's not a magic bullet. It is likely we'll need quite a bit more than that. But moreover, what those 3.5% of people are doing matters greatly because they need to capture the loyalty of millions of other people. So we need to think of the things that we're doing in protests as a kind of performance, as political theater, right? Inviting people, more and more of them, into the resistance movement. The other thing is that the movement needs to pivot at this point from defense, which is protest, to offense, which is disruption, right? So non-cooperation at a mass scale, boycotts, strikes, and other kinds of actions of that sort will need to be mounted. Importantly, though, we also need people within government to resist as much as possible to slow things down. Now, if we rely on them entirely, the odds, historically speaking, are about 7 to 8% that they will succeed. If a mass civil resistance movement takes action, the odds go up to over 50%. And this is a key thing here. If labor, organized labor, gets robustly and seriously involved, your chances go up dramatically from there. Some say over 80% chance of winning. And that's because they can't run their companies without us. They need workers, they need consumers. Consumers in the United States are about 66 or 67% of the flow through the economy. If we simply withhold that money, we can have a huge impact. But that's where we are. And it has a tremendous, it has tremendous significance for places like Taiwan, which really must have allies at the global level in order to be able to survive what's happening now.
Again, thank you. These are really brilliant, thought-provoking comments from all of you. And I'm going to go back to you, Van, now on because you painted a picture of economic inequality is a weak point, and we've got oligarchs, we've got multinational corporations, and they pretend that they don't have politics. They pretend that they're not right-wing, or maybe some of them are coming out as right-wing now, but not the multinational corporations, and there is a politics to their economic agendas, and by ignoring that, it helps them better influence our elections, better, by the public. And I'm wondering what you think we can do about this massive problem.
Get ready for a general strike. I'm serious, but also that's not my answer. So it's not a coincidence that like most dictatorships today have oligarchs within them, or that they're run by oligarchs. Like the global financial capital system is kind of at the root of authoritarianism, but more than that, it is what keeps authoritarianism going in the 21st century right now, you know? So we have to kind of situate oligarchs in the global context that made them. And this is uncomfortable for a lot of Americans because it's the bargain of American hegemony going back to like the early 1970s, that it was basically just totally cool to be politically illiberal as a regime so long as you were economically liberal. And even US détente with China fits that mold. Like there were other things going on, but Sino-US détente originally took place in the context of that larger global bargain in the 70s. And so that's not just in the past. Like even more so today, I would argue, than at that time. Western governments just don't care if you're an autocrat, as long as you're not nationalizing industries and as long as you are offshoring your surpluses into Western tax havens or into Hollywood or into tech VCs or into big city real estate in like London, Vancouver, New York, right? So capitalist dictators, which is most modern dictators, they learn how to speak the language of Davos. They send their kids to Western private schools. Like we all know people who've gone to school with the children of Saudi princes and Filipino kleptocrats. Some of us have gone to those schools with them, you know? And like these people provide the kind of like the capital backing for VC investments in unicorn nonsense like AI or in the UFC or into Paramount or in the film industry, as Vanessa knows, you know? So like they become anonymous investors in shell corporations that then invest in asset management firms who legally buy up real estate in the West and invest in businesses in the West. And then the rich governments of the West have no ability or desire even to deal with this because their service-based economies, our service-based economies, are direct beneficiaries of these ill-gotten capital inflows from foreign oligarchies. And the consequence of all of this like corrupt ass system is more inequality, more asset price inflation. And so people in my generation can't afford to buy a house as a consequence of all of this. And if you can't make a family and buy a house and you're afraid of going bankrupt if you break your leg or get cancer, what are you going to do? You know, that's the vulnerability that is the, you know, the like far right politics has more uptake in systems that have been broken by the politics of oligarchy. And so the way the global economy has been structured since the late 70s has made global inequality much worse, made domestic inequality in democracies much worse, even as we still have the right to vote. And it's undermined working class power in democracies.
Okay, I'm going to double down on this narrative before we go back to Catherine and Taiwan. Scott, can you give us a sense of how these disinformation narratives and strategies are used to divide people and what we can do to build a resilience? Yeah.
Sure. I do want to put a pin in something that Van said because I think it's absolutely true and something we should be really taking seriously, which is that you know, globalization has changed the context for democracy, right? The extreme wealth inequality that came out of that period from the 70s until now, the insulating of financial markets and large corporations from democratic decision making, all of those things have contributed to the extraordinary kind of wealth inequality we live with. And what we seem to be seeing here is a faction of capitalists basically breaking off and deciding they no longer need democracy in order to function. They don't need that infrastructure. They don't need, you know, all of that stuff. And what they're doing instead is trying to end democracy as a way of forever protecting themselves from the possibility of a rebellion. And, you know, they're looking around themselves at the climate change context that we're in. They understand that those problems are real. That's, you know, when they say they're not, that's just disinformation. Just, I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind and understand that business will have to play a very important role in this because some factions of business do not benefit from the authoritarian agenda. But, you know, the thing about disinformation in general, though, is that what most people get wrong about it is that they think the goal is to make you believe a lie, right? It's not. The goal is actually a lot simpler and more insidious than that. It's the goal is to make you distrust potential allies, to exhaust you to the point where you no longer feel like engaging, to make compromise seem like a betrayal by making everything seem so extreme. You're always choosing between one thing or another, and so you can't find anywhere in the middle to meet. And to prevent collective action in part by, through the kind of collective effect of this, which is the kind of paralyzation of people who are in the middle. So, the goal of disinformation isn't persuasion, it's paralysis. And when movements that could challenge power are divided, exhausted, and unable to work together, the authoritarians win without firing a shot. This is why, Steve Bannon has been directing the Trump administration to quote unquote, fill the zone with shit. Is to simply overwhelm us to the point where we can no longer tell what's true or not true and who our allies are or who our enemies are. So, there's some good examples of this. One is from the Russian playbook. They basically tend to amplify extremes, right? So from 2016 to the present, the Russian Internet Research Agency, a troll farm behind election interference, did something really brilliant and terrifying. They had fake Black Lives Matter pages, organizing protests against police, and at the same time, fake Blue Lives Matter pages doing the same thing, organizing protests supporting the police. Then, and this is the key, they organized both groups to show up at the same place at the same time, because the goal was not to support either side, not to make anyone believe Russia cares about American policing. The goal was to make Americans fight each other and make reconciliation impossible. So, they found a real tension, right? Police accountability versus public safety, which is a genuine issue that reasonable people disagree on here in the US. They amplified the extremes on both sides. So the question that you're faced with seems to be either a complete abolition of all law enforcement or a police state, right? They suppress the moderates, people who are bridge builders, reformers, etc. People who are seeking common ground in general get drowned out in these kinds of debates. And then they just kind of step back and watch us fight. Each side now sees the other as the enemy and not as neighbors with legitimate concerns. So communities that could build coalitions around reform, around, say, both safety and accountability in policing, instead fracture into camps that can't even talk to each other. And we've seen this happen over and over and over again. There have been institutions in the United States that have been practically brought to their knees by these kinds of bots moving disinformation that lead people to believe that the enemy is within, or cause them to take extreme positions and then make it untenable for them to maintain the kind of diverse, ideologically and culturally diverse constituencies we need in order to be effective in a fight against authoritarians. So, they don't need to convince you that your side is right. That's something really important to remember. They just need to convince you that the other side is your enemy, right? And they can do this also through micro-targeted kind of, campaigns of division. They do it by, for example, telling your neighbors things that you might be saying, and then telling you things that your neighbors might be saying, neither of them true, but that lead us to understand the reality that we're in from a totally different perspectives. And then they set us at each other and make us fight. Right. So an example from vaccine messaging is in Black communities, they talk to people about the Tuskegee experiments and other kinds of ways in which the medical establishment has horribly abused Black people. They say, don't trust the government because they've experimented on us before, basically. But then to white conservatives, they say that the vaccines are government control, that they're violating your freedom by forcing you to put things in your body that you don't want and don't know much about, right? Both of those messages are designed to prevent a coalition to form around something like public health. And, so Black communities and white working class communities both need accessible healthcare, but we find ourselves fighting about vaccines. You can't counter an argument if you don't know it's being made, is the key tactic here. Your neighbor genuinely believes you're the problem because they've been fed completely different information. And when you try to talk to each other, you're literally living in different information ecosystems. So, no wonder we can't find no common ground. No wonder we each think the other side is just nothing but a bunch of liars, right? Because we have been manipulated into the belief that they're saying things and believe things that they may or may not believe, but that will certainly set us at each other's throats. So that's kind of where we are now. And it's, a powerful strategy that has worked extremely well here in the United States because we have for so long been such a divided nation. We should never forget that the first, kind of political expression of the kind of capitalism here in the United States originally was white supremacy and patriarchy. And so those create contradictions to democracy that then become these sort of flashpoints for conflict. Freedom here has been a constant struggle because we understand it so differently. And so in these contexts, they can really, really make hay. It's particularly true of multi-ethnic Western nations, particularly liberal democracies, where they can start this kind of fighting and then see it spin out. And of course, with social media, it's been magnified many times over again.
Wow, this discussion, I hope everyone who gets a chance to see this panel watches it over and over again. There's so much here that we can all learn from, and I hope we all will share. Catherine, and I thought about this when I was working on Invisible Nation, and so I'm so glad you shared your experience and also just the dissonance I felt when I first started filming in Taiwan was when Trump came to power in the US the first time. And I was just kind of blown away by what I was seeing of young people participating in their government in Taiwan. And, Tuesday here in the United States, with the Democrats winning many elections across the country, women, people of color, all different kinds of people who have been excluded from our democracy, it gave me a feeling of hope for a night. I know that we still have to keep fighting, and I know we have many elections to come, and I know with this government shutdown, Trump is intending to just try to take all the power into his own hands. Taiwan and the people of Taiwan have fought not just one, but two authoritarian regimes, starting with the Republic of China coming from losing the Civil War and then moving into democratization. But now the People's Republic of China, which for 70 years has never given up pushing and putting a military threat on Taiwan. So how have the people of Taiwan survived? What is the secret to the building of such a strong democracy there? And what can we learn from you in Taiwan?
Yeah, I hope there is a lot to be learned from Taiwan. I think it's a really interesting and unique case study. So I would say when Taiwan democratized in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was fighting what was civil society, dissidents, journalists, publishers, students, labor unions, environmental organizations, indigenous groups. What they were fighting was what at the time was the longest martial law regime in the world, only recently surpassed by Syria. And I think when that tipping point happened, the markers were sort of everywhere, going back to what Scott had said in the answer to his the first question. You were seeing mass street protests, mass student occupations, the formation of new political parties, self-immolations, the proliferation of new media. But I think, it's probably impossible to really pinpoint what either kind of tiny or sizable act of resistance would sort of decisively end martial law, end the restrictions against multi-party democracy. And so I think that's kind of important to keep in mind. I think that you don't really know which act will really help to kind of topple what seems at the time like a regime that might never end. And so, and I think there's a lot of debate within the political science circles about, again, like what are the factors that help Taiwan to democratize. Certainly the Kuomintang regime in power at the time also kind of made concessions and acknowledged, I think, that what was up until that point a kind of minority regime based on two things. One, the kind of ethnic superiority of people who had settled in Taiwan, refugees and soldiers and civil servants and bureaucrats, et cetera, who had come and settled in Taiwan after the loss of the Chinese Civil War. And then also at the time was kind of based on this, I think, fantastical, ridiculous premise that the KMT regime was going to be able to militarily retake China. And so those two ideas, ethnic superiority, and then the idea that Taiwan was going to be used as a base to retake China, I think both those ideas also kind of had to die. So I think going back to what Scott and Van have been saying, in the United States, there's sort of different ideas that I think have been really powerful in the American imagination that probably also, again, kind of have to be interrogated and broken down in order for resistance to be successful. I think, in a way, not that it was an easy task to democratize in the 1980s and 1990s, but of course, Taiwan today, like many societies, is facing a different set of challenges. So today, the threat really is from the People's Republic of China. And there's sort of been an inversion, right? Now it's the PRC that openly says, it is willing to invade Taiwan. It is willing to create and start a hot war. Currently, there's peace. People in Taiwan, people in China live at peace, And so the threat of an invasion really is about creating chaos and creating misery, human misery, where currently, people live at peace and they're able to raise their families in peace. So the threat now is from a China that has said it's willing to invade, to take territory that it currently and in the past has the PRC has never governed. And so the challenges are also different, again, in this kind of age of social media and media disinformation and the kind of deliberate manipulation of the tools of communication in order to, I think there's two things that's happening. One is that this disinformation from the PRC. Taiwan is, along with like Latvia, kind of the number one, number two target of foreign disinformation around the world, and target of foreign disinformation in the world. And it's targeted at two audiences. One is a kind of external audience, outwardly to the rest of the world, to tell the rest of the world Taiwan is just a province of China. It's no different than Hong Kong or Hainan. And I think, again, not only does Invisible Nation show this, but if you come visit Taiwan, you can see immediately that that's empirically true, right? It's sort of disproved by your experience on the ground, everything from, entering customs here to how people identify themselves to, how they live their daily lives, the government that they interface with. So that's one target of the disinformation. The other target, I think, is the audience internally within Taiwan, which is to undermine confidence in liberal democracy as a way of life, undermine confidence that Taiwan will be able to resist if an invasion comes. Both that civil society will fracture and that also the kind of military defense will be insufficient. And so I think, if we want to be optimistic, though, and of course, as someone who decided to move to Taiwan a little bit later in my adult life. I moved here to get married. I moved here to start a family. I think it is a remarkable story that so far Taiwanese will and agency, even though this is a society that is quite divided on a lot of issues, there is still a very strong, robust consensus in Taiwan around retaining what is a very hard-won democracy. And so I think that's the sort of crucial factor in which why this Taiwan question remains open. Why Taiwan has sort of not been absorbed by China yet is that simply the Taiwanese people don't want to be. They don't want to lose their democracy. It's that precious to them. And so democracy itself, is really, how can we define a democracy, liberal democracy? At least one way is to say, that power can change hands across party lines, that there can be new parties that come into existence. Democracy itself is what the People's Republic of China really is demanding as the sacrifice from Taiwan. And so I think it's so interesting to live here now, because I think the critical question that Taiwanese people face every day, it's kind of in the background for a lot of people. I don't think most people are sort of thinking about it every single moment, because you have to get on with your life. But the question is what it means to flourish in the face of this type of existential threat to your liberal democracy, to your kind of liberal democratic way of life, which is also kind of a threat to essentially your existence as you know it, your life as you know it, while sort of also doing this with one hand tied behind your back because of the lack of recognition of your citizenship and your kind of identity from global institutions and national governments, whether they be authoritarian or democratic.
Wow. I'm so glad you're all speaking to the question of defining democracy too, because language matters. And if we're aware that the non-democratic countries are happy that the United States looks so bad but is calling itself a democracy when, as Scott said, we're really not a functioning democracy. So don't look at our government, look at the people on the ground in the country who do care about fighting for democracy, one that we know we don't have yet. I think that Van Jackson, I'm going to you now. You've written so well about the U.S.-China relationship in the Pacific Power Paradox, in the Rivalry Peril. And I think that you're one of the few scholars of China, actually, who also manages to hold the U.S. accountable, again, for our undemocratic practices. Undiplomatic to shout out your podcast. But can you speak to how Taiwan can survive in this global context, and what can be done in terms of alliances in the international system that support democracy? Maybe it is more about the people or civil society. What do we do? How can we strengthen it globally?
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard of the Sinatra test. So it's like, if you can make it as a lounge singer in New York, you can make it anywhere, right? And so this is like a social science, terminology, but obviously like pop culture kish. So Taiwan to me is like the Sinatra test of progressive anti-militarist foreign policy, because it's such a tough issue. Catherine touched on this. Invisible Nation, actually, one of its many strengths was conveying just how fraught Taiwan's security situation is, and so thinking from the perspective of like US foreign policy, the former hegemon of the world system, I think the most important thing that democracies can do, with having Taiwan specifically in mind, even, is to kind of like dial back this impulse toward great power rivalry with China. It's like a huge travesty / tragedy that some of the loudest proponents of Taiwan on the global stage are far-right adjacent national security bros who use Taiwan as a way to increase their own military spending and arms sales and war planning. And Taiwan's circumstances and identity being exploited in that way makes Taiwan specifically less secure, but it also screws everybody. It makes everybody worse off, you know? Like, this is my latest book, like rivalry itself threatens peace, democracy, and equality. Like, it's all downside. And so there's a knee-jerk temptation, I think, to say that, well, the PRC is belligerent, aggressive, menacing of Taiwan's security, and that's actually true, right? But it does not follow that PRC jingoism ought to be dealt with by tit for tat jingoism, right? Jingoism in kind, like Fred Hampton, Black Panther Party, right? He said, you know, we're going to fight racism not with racism, but with solidarity. We're going to fight capitalism not with Black capitalism, but with socialism. And so the PRC has laid claim to Taiwan for generations at this point. It's not new, but what we have to keep in mind is that in my lifetime, Taiwan's security has rarely felt so precarious as it has since around 2016-ish, which is precisely when what the US calls great power competition started, right? The material reality of the China threat did not change much between 2015 and 2017, but the perceptions of Taiwanese elites changed quite a bit, and so did China's willingness to be assertive on like many fronts toward Taiwan, right? And what I'm saying is that was happening in light of a darker shift in China's relations with the US. So the fact that China wants to absorb Taiwan and has been building a military to do it, that is more or less threatening depending on the geopolitical context. And so the job of democracies is to foster a geopolitical context that makes the reality of an imbalance of power between China and Taiwan, that makes it less salient and that makes it less threatening to Taiwan. And that means fostering stable, cooperative relations that normalize coexistence and that uphold international law. And ideally, you could decouple that from notions of American power, because American power is a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's the reason why you get assistance. Sometimes it's the reason why you get fucked over in Sino-US détente in the 70s. You know what I mean? So international law, not American power. That is the way, I think.
Great. Scott, how can we go back to the question of civil society and how we can all support each other in all of our different countries that want democracy to survive and flourish?
Well, I think that we need to be really clear that the ship of democracy is taking on water. You know, what we're doing right now is bailing. We're not near any safe port, and so bail we must. But we have to recognize that it's just simply not seaworthy in the context of contemporary reality, right? Globalization, extreme wealth inequality, climate change, all of these factors play important roles. We also have a mass migration crisis in the world that people in the United States often don't quite understand, you know, but there are millions of people living in refugee camps everywhere, and mass migration is just the reality. And so our traditional ideas about national borders are going to be threatened, and their association with national sovereignty, of course, then is threatened. And that is the one most, you know, well, every national government within the nation state system sanctifies violence in the name of protection of its national sovereignty, right? And so these arguments that are being made could drive us to more and more conflict and perhaps even to a civil war. You know, that's not an unrealistic possibility. But I think that we still have a lot of hope. You know, I think we've demonstrated over and over again that there is hope out there. In Portland, Oregon, for example, you know, the National Guard is being deployed and ICE is there. We see ICE agents all over the place in Portland now. They claim that there's a war going on in Portland when no such thing is happening. You know, I mean, like the ICE agents are standing outside of the ICE building while the naked bike ride goes by and the Portland Marathon goes and the Foreman's Market is two like blocks away, you know.
Telling me those
So,
frogs aren't a threat?
Yes,
and
yes, those
yes, and
awesome
they're the
concepts.
frogs.
They were so good.
But once people got wind of it, it only took them 24 hours to mobilize 2,500 people on the waterfront park, which is the main, you know, sort of tourist attraction in the city. And so we are starting to learn that we have a greater capacity than we ever imagined ourselves to have. People are also starting to step up and reach for real power. You know, what happened really with democracies around the world is that the Cold War basically stabilized them, but made them very repressive. Right. At the end of the Cold War, when all that repression was to be lifted, the far right understood better than the far left what the impact would be. That there would be all these cultural fault lines, whether they're between Serbia and Croatia or between, you know, people according to different races in the United States. Those cultural fault lines could be turned into political battle lines. And so they waged culture wars against us. And we defended ourselves. We got into the very important posture of refuting the claims that they were making and defending the constituents that were under attack. But that basically became the politic of the progressive community through much of the 90s, right? What we weren't paying attention to was all the while a class war was being waged. And the underpinnings of democracy were being eroded, and that we were actually playing a party to it because we contributed to toxic polarization by assuming that actually the most extreme voices were representative of the entire Republican Party, for one example. And so, you know, all of those things we went through, and it made us really, really unfit to fight this fight. I'm seeing people get fit to fight this fight in minutes. You know, I mean, people are just showing us over and over again here in the United States that they are intelligent and adaptable. They can learn, you know, and change to meet changing circumstances. So I see it as that kind of opportunity. You know, we don't at the 22nd Century Initiative and the work that we do, we don't say a U-turn. We don't say that we're trying to protect democracy. We're trying to promote the democratic potential of the United States. And what we're trying to do is to fight for a more democratic future. So not go back to the 20th century form of democracy that we had, which is no longer viable in the 21st century, but to start to actually think about what it is that we need to be doing going forward in order to fight for the future. What are the issues? What are the demands? What is the new vision of society? Because we're entering a time when we will, you know, the old political paradigm of the 20th century is falling apart. And a new one is emerging. At this point, it looks like an authoritarian reality that will be the dominant voice in the world. But that doesn't mean we can't fight back. We very much can. You know, until the pandemic happened, democracy movements were rising all over the world. The pandemic shuttered those movements, but they can come back, right? And so we just need to create that context. In all of that, I have to say, Catherine, what's happening in Taiwan for people in the United States should be like a school. People should be studying what's happening there. A whole of society defense of democracy that is not being won with soldiers, but with ordinary citizens. I mean, that's where we need to be at, right? We need to be there. We need to be able to deal with disinformation in real time. We need to be able to, you know, like actually integrate into our daily lives, into our civic lives, this duty of protecting our freedoms. If we don't want to use the word democracy, I would say protecting freedom and the possibility of equity within the context of mutual interdependence. And so, I mean, I think that what's happening in Taiwan is incredibly exciting. At the same time, it's very, you know, I understand it's scary, you know, but it's a nation of what, 23 or 24 million people who are only 100 miles away from a major authoritarian state that claims to own them. And yet this is what they're doing. You know, we can take heart and know that people around the world are incredibly creative. So many good things could happen.
I love that. And that's a beautiful,
Very positive.
yeah, positive and closing statement. Now I want to ask you, Van, in the context of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I believe it was one of your podcasts that the question of what happened to the peace dividend came up. I'm kind of wondering about that peace dividend. I'm kind of wondering what you think are some actions our viewers can take or institutions can take to strengthen democracy.
It's funny you mentioned that. There is a peace dividend movement by like 60-something Nobel laureates and economists and physicists and just like a who's who of, right-minded intellectuals, which is to say left-minded intellectuals. Sorry. And they have like relaunched a couple years ago a movement. I think they're calling it peace dividend, but they're just asking for all of our governments around the world to commit 2% of national spending to to divert it from military spending into social welfare, public programs, and into like a UN fund, basically, for national development and for the global South. And that's hard to argue with in my mind. That's a huge down payment, and especially for a country like the US and China in particular, like these are the two countries that should be leading the way in signaling a peaceful path if either of them wants it. Sometimes it feels like neither of them wants a peaceful path, you know? So there's something to that. In terms of what people can do, like read a book and go to a protest, man. Like even if you're someone who thinks protests are strategically ineffective, they're really transformative to the person. Like they feed your soul. They're kind of radicalizing in the best way. And like for me, they started making me eventually ask deeper questions, and so it's like just doing it is making civic democracy more real, regardless of whether there's a cause and effect, outcome that you can measure. It strikes me too that like the way Scott and Catherine were talking about Taiwan civic democracy, Taiwan is kind of a case study or an exemplar of a lot of the best practices that this guy Gene Sharp used to write about. So he was considered like the Clausewitz of nonviolence, and his name carries in every place where there's been a democratic revolution for like 50 years. And he had a lot of work like that he wrote about in the European context specifically, but where he talked about like civilian-based deterrence, which had everything to do with robust civil society and creating a sense of national solidarity, and that being actually like a real deterrent of like Western European governments and Eastern European governments to what was at the time the fear of Soviet encroachment. And see, he was like, the nukes and the missiles ain't gonna save you. That's what threatens you. You can't do hair of the dog logic when you're facing a military threat. Like that's a dead end. He's like, but there is such a thing as like you can make your society sort of like impregnable to a belligerent force on the outside. And he was writing in a pre-Taiwan context because Taiwan was not a democracy at that point. But there's something in that. I mean, somebody should revisit that because like it seems like Taiwan might actually be an exemplar case there.
Thank you. And Catherine, are there any concluding thoughts or actions you think we should suggest to viewers about how to strengthen democracy, whether here in the US or in Taiwan or anywhere in the world, really?
Yeah, actually, when I was growing up, because of my family's particular political background, we kind of only associated with people who were very pro kind of self-determination, pro international recognition for Taiwan. And then there were other people, other immigrants from Taiwan who had other political beliefs, and we kind of never really interacted with them. And then I learned moving here that, it's a small island, and people live side by side, cheek to jowl, and they live with people who have different views on how to deal with the China threat, and different views on which political party they support, and the best path forward to peace. And there's no avoiding your neighbors. There's no avoiding your your coworkers and your friends and your classmates. And even I think that is a really powerful lesson in needing to get along and have face-to-face conversations and interactions to try to understand people who think differently. And I think the other lesson here that I've just loved observing in action is that democracy here is noisy, it's performative, it's public. And so any given day, any given weekend, you can walk down the streets of Taipei and see protests about, kind of recognition for Palestinian statehood, to justice for indigenous hunters, and to kind of protesting at visits by Taiwanese officials to China. Like the gamut of issues that people care about is so wide, so broad, and you can really just get out there and protest. And I think that is transformative to see, going back to what you said, Van, to participate personally. There's so many opportunities for that here, and also to watch other people participating. And so I would say, yeah, get off your screen, get off your screens and go out into the streets and do democracy in the streets.
And I'm going to add, read all of the books and the Substack by you three. This has been such a special conversation. Seriously, I wish we had 3 more hours to continue. I'm so grateful for all of your clarity, your courage, insight. I mean, maybe we do a part 2. Yeah. So Invisible Nation does remind us that democracy, Taiwan reminds us, and everyone here in this conversation, democracy isn't self-sustaining. It requires vigilance and solidarity across borders, sectors, and communities. And what we've heard tonight is that disinformation and corruption are not abstract threats. They are tools designed to weaken our belief in shared truth and collective power. But we've also heard all the ways to fight back through transparency, civic innovation, and coalition building grounded in justice. Taiwan's story is not just about one island resisting authoritarian influence. It's about the power of ordinary people to defend and reinvent democracy in the 21st century. So we invite everyone to continue this conversation, share the film, connect with our partners, and explore resources available on our website and in the chat. And on behalf of Invisible Nation, the whole team, thank you for joining us and for standing with those who continue to imagine and build a freer future.